So welcome everyone to our Caregiver webinar, Building Positive Feeding Foundations. So we have our wonderful OT, Maggie, here with us tonight, and I'm gonna go ahead and hand it over to her. Take it away, Maggie.
Hi, yes, I am Maggie, and I'm an occupational therapist in Indiana, and I work at the Broader Pool Center for Bierman. Um, so this presentation, webinar just is going over um, not so much like everything about feeding, but just kind of some strategies for parents or caregivers, and just some foundational things with feeding that might be super helpful. Um, I'll go to the next slide. So some of the things we're going to be going over today are feeding and just a brief feeding and developmental milestones, and an introduction on feeding difficulties, um, a going over some play-based approaches to trying new foods, kind of trying to make mealtime fun again, and then some tools and strategies to aid in interventions for feeding difficulties at home. Um, so this is actually my son. I have a 7-year-old, but I wanted to use a couple pictures of him working on some feeding. So you see him using like his pincer grasp to pick up some food. And then down below, you see him when he's a little bit older and he's using a fork. Um, so this just kind of, I didn't put ages. I just kind of put like, this is kind of the progression it goes in. But you would start off, your child might finger feed themselves. And then after that, they might begin to use a spoon, but they might be really messy with it, thinking like the purees and those kind of things you start with. And then you would jump into maybe they get a little bit better, less messy with the spoon. So independently using that spoon. Then they might work on using a fork, and it might be a little bit messy, but they're maybe eating more foods that would require a fork versus a spoon. Um, Independently using a fork, and then later on, they might learn how to use a knife to spread foods, cut foods. And then by the time, they've learned all of this stuff, maybe they're more they can use the utensils to cut food independently, can use a spoon and fork independently during mealtime. Um, so this just kind of looks at bottle and open cup, straw cup. As an occupational therapist, I work a lot on helping kids use like a straw cup or an open cup. I know like sensory wise, some kids really prefer the bottle. And just kind of working on those oral motor skills they might need for using a straw cup is really going to help with their like eating skills as well. So maybe they do start out with like a bottle or breastfeeding. And then honestly, you can introduce an open cup with assistance and a straw cup within around like 6 months. You could also introduce like water bottles, like things that are easier on the go when they're a little bit older. I feel like we did more at like 12 months with my son. Like we did do the sippy cups, but the oral motor skills, it's a little bit better for the to use the straw cup, which they make a lot of really great non-spill ones now. But this is just a general thing. But I feel like sometimes parents don't know how often or how soon you can start introducing an open cup or a straw cup to your child. Okay, so texture progression. So they'll start with thin purees, then move on to more thick purees, dissolvable solids, then mashed or minced solids, soft, simple textured solids, and mixed textured foods. So just kind of like when I'm looking at this too, I'm thinking about if your child is maybe still on like the dissolvable solids, that this list might give you an idea of like next we could try this type of food with them. So again, I didn't put like ages, but just kind of looking at this as like where your child is right now and seeing what you might be able to try next. Um, so I kind of did a little like why is this important? Why are self-feeding skills important, especially like using a fork and a spoon by themselves, using a straw cup, using an open cup, or just multiple variations of those. Um, so challenges with independent self-feeding can impact family mealtime. So teaching these skills helps increase your child's autonomy and independence, which can really positively impact their food exploration and mealtime in general. So it can be really helpful for them to be independent and be able to feed themselves and be able to kind of choose what they're eating too. That's that's something that is very important. Okay, so this is just kind of an overall, this picture is kind of funny. My son is a picky eater himself. So this was a picture from daycare where they captioned it like, I just cropped him out of there, but all the other kids were smiling and having fun, but they said, "We're having so much fun trying green foods." And he is not so much having fun trying green foods. Um, so feeding difficulties can be suspected when your child demonstrates one or more of the following. So maybe they're refusing to eat different foods more than 1 month. Prolonged mealtimes. Mealtimes are just taking a really long time. You might have to distract your kid to increase the intake. So thinking like, and I'm guilty of this myself, of like, we're watching a movie or something while we're eating. So they're distracted, but they're just kind of like just eating because, if we didn't have a distraction, we might just be off somewhere else. Lack of an appropriate independent feeding. So thinking of like spoon and fork use if they're old enough to be able to do that by themselves. Prolonged bottle feeding. So maybe they are refusing to use anything else other than the bottle. Nocturnal feeding. They're waking up and they're wanting to eat at night when it's after that infant stage where they are waking up to eat. Failure to progress to advanced textures. So maybe they only eat this one texture of food, or like they'll only eat the purees, but they just can't move on to that next step of like the thicker purees or the mixed textured foods. So I kind of just popped this in, like, why is this important for our population? For myself, working at an ABA clinic and working with autistic children. So up to 85% of autistic children experience feeding challenges that might negatively impact their health, nutrition, developmental milestones, social skills, and family life. So sensory-based feeding challenges are the most common among some studies that I read, which makes a lot of sense. And I work on a lot of sensory-based feeding challenges at Bierman. And then a multidisciplinary, child-led, family-oriented approach to feeding can include, myself, the OT, the speech therapist. I mostly would consult with her with like oral motor skills. Are they able to move the food around in their mouth? Are they able to chew and swallow the food? The BCBA maybe can clue us into some behavior challenges that maybe we're going to incorporate into our mealtime. A dietitian, nutritionist, or other specialized healthcare professionals. It's super beneficial to have a team of people be on your child's team to kind of help them with these feeding difficulties. And then, they'll be able to determine appropriate interventions that will positively impact mealtime. So that was kind of more of like a background, just like a really quick overview of some feeding developmental milestones. And so now I'm just kind of jumping into some strategies that you can use. So a lot of times I'll encourage parents to use play to introduce new foods and to gain some exposure. So sometimes we'll do sensory bins. So like that first picture there it looks like SpaghettiOs with trucks. And maybe your child really loves to play with trucks and you're trying to get them kind of exposed to new foods, and maybe like they do like pasta, but they don't really like the reds, or they haven't tried the red sauce or something. Something like this is kind of a way to get them exposed to it. They can smell it, they might touch it, at least touching it with the truck. They're moving it around, they're hearing what it sounds like, without having that expectation that they have to eat it, but they're still able to get used to that food, get to know that food. I love using little, like, they sell fruit and veggie, like cookie cutters. So you can like cut the food, excuse me, into a fun shape. So like this one, I think they cut up little like cucumbers into stars and like cheese into stars. So I've done that even if like I know the kid's not going to eat it, maybe we'll make something with it. So we'll like use the food cutters to cut the food into like I don't know, there's a cookie cutter I have that's Mickey Mouse. Maybe they love Mickey Mouse. So we're making Mickey Mouse out of carrots or something. And so they're cutting it, they're holding it, they're touching it. They might be smelling it because it's right there. And we might try and like transition into like, oh, let's try and like lick it or take a bite. But even if not, they're still touching it and they're getting to know the food through some food exposure. And then sometimes we'll use like stacking food, building with food. Some food is easier to do this than others. Um, but sometimes that kind of play is beneficial too. And it's still the same kind of idea of just getting exposed to these new foods. Um, Another strategy that we might use is called food chaining. So this is just a really brief overview of food chaining. So it's not anything super detailed. But say your child loves chicken nuggets. Maybe it's even like a very specific brand of chicken nugget. And you just want them to try another type of breaded protein. So for this example, for that goal one, I used a fish stick. So maybe like you start with the chicken nugget. They love the chicken nugget. Maybe you're able to get them to try a chicken fry, which is the same shape as the fish stick. And then maybe you try the fish stick after that. Another strategy sometimes we'll use with the food chaining is you might like add, if they like different sauces. So maybe they dip their chicken nugget in barbecue sauce. So maybe you try like, they like the chicken fry and then you like dip the chicken fry in barbecue sauce and then maybe the fish stick with the barbecue sauce. So just trying to like chain it to where there's something similar in each step, something that they know, something that's like uh, very familiar to them. And so the goal number two, so maybe they love French fries and eat French fries all the time, but you would love for them to try some fruit, to just add some fruit to their diet. So maybe you start with a French fry, but then maybe you and them do some food play and you cut an apple into the shape of a French fry. Like you kind of peel the apple, and so it kind of looks like a French fry. And there might be some steps in between, but maybe eventually we're gonna get to apple slices. So just kind of going like step by step. So we move from the French fry, which is like that long shape, cut the apple that same way, so it's the same, and then go on to apple slices. This actually comes from, and I put a bunch of resources at the bottom too, or at the bottom of this presentation. There is a registered dietitian who has a website called Kids Eat in Color, and she has a lot of great resources for parents to work on feeding. And this list actually comes from her website, and I use it often when I'm talking to parents. So the first step, this is kind of like tips for caregivers at mealtime. So like just kind of things to think about when you're trying to set up your child for success and have a really positive environment around meal times. So starting with like no pressure meals. So trying to create a pleasant and inviting environment for eating. So I'm thinking like you're setting out the food. Maybe you have things that like your child's going to eat something familiar, but there's no pressure that like they have to eat this one food. It's just kind of they're getting used to it, but it's a no pressure environment. You might say things like you can eat it when you're ready. So provide a time for the kids to sit at the table. So maybe like your kid's a grazer and they come to the table and then they run away 2 seconds later and then they come back and they take a bite and then they run away. Maybe you kind of structure it like you sit down and you're there for like a couple minutes, something that's age appropriate for your child. and then they're able to get up. But there's still no pressure for them to eat the food. They're just sitting there, but they're watching everybody eat. They're watching everybody like scoop the food. Maybe they're helping scoop the food, but there's no pressure. um, Having something else that might help for grazing, which might be something to happen gradually, is to have open and closed hours for the kitchen. So not just being like breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but having like, you know, we're eating breakfast during this hour, but then 2 hours later, we're doing a snack time. But then 2 hours later, we're doing lunch time. And then 2 hours later, a snack, and then dinner. So make sure there's an appropriate amount of time that food is offered, but having those designated meal times can sometimes be really helpful for working on sitting down and eating meals and trying new foods. Another thing is sitting down to eat, and I'll go over. I probably should have put it before this, but just kind of appropriate seating for kids, because sometimes if like your legs are dangling, that feels very unstable, and a lot of our kids are sitting in chairs that are way too tall for them. So maybe they're wiggling, they just want to get up because their feet are dangling and they feel like they need to feel grounded. So maybe getting an appropriate chair for them, even if it's just putting some books under their feet so their feet have something to rest on, nothing fancy. But sitting down to eat with the family is helpful. um, Having the caregivers set the menu. So like for me, when I do mealtime, it'll be served family style, which I'll go over that too, but it's just like you have all the food in the middle, and then everyone is serving themselves, or at least like everyone's getting kind of the same thing to eat. And the caregiver setting the menu, so they're providing what is going to be on the menu for dinner. I always recommend having at least one thing that you know your child can fill up on and eat. And it can even be like you have spaghetti and meatballs, but then you also have like a whole container of like there's chicken nuggets on the table that are served to everyone who wants to eat it. So it's not like a totally separate thing from for your child. It's served with the meal. Um, Add some fun with food activities. So kind of what I said, like cutting the food in a new shape, like using new utensils, involving the child with cooking. I love to do this. It's another great way for food exposure. Um, and then like keep serving the food. I know that that's not always feasible. You don't want to keep making like a bunch of something that's really expensive. But if you're able to, like serve it as often as you can, instead of like even if say you made green beans and your child didn't eat any of the green beans this time, maybe next time they will eat green beans. So don't stop serving it just because maybe your child didn't like it that time, unless maybe, if my child like actually tries something and he tells me he didn't like it, or shows me in some way he didn't like it, maybe I'll try something a little bit different. But don't shy away from serving something, even if your child did not interact with it on that particular occasion. Um, Another good one that this dietitian on Kids Eat in Color goes over is teaching kids what foods do to our bodies. Um, I actually had a great conversation with my son today on our way to his soccer game. We had to leave school and eat dinner really fast. And we were talking through what he had. He had a protein, he had chicken nuggets, he had pasta, and he had fruit. So I was kind of going through. He said something to me like, "Oh, is pasta bad for you, or is it good for you?" And so I told him I don't really love to use good for you and bad for you. More of like this food does this for our body, and this food does this for our body. So we talked about how the pasta has carbohydrates, and my child is 7, so he understands that. But you could just say like yellow foods give us energy, um, and like the fruit also can give us energy and help provide some. So he had oranges, so that might also hydrate our body. Carrots help our vision. And kids think that's really cool sometimes to hear like kids are helping your eye, or carrots are helping your eyes. Um, and then another good tip is making desserts less exciting. So a lot of times we'll want to like hold off on dessert. and be like, you need to eat your meal first before this. And if that becomes such a struggle where your kid is refusing to eat their food, or your kid is getting really upset trying to eat their food because they're so ready for dessert, sometimes adding a little bit of dessert to their meal with their meal um, makes it less exciting, and it's just part of the meal. Um, Now, I wouldn't say like, you have cake and you just keep giving them more servings of cake. It could be like you got like an M&M with dinner or something like that, like something small. Still have it be the caregiver is kind of setting boundaries with it, but not making it off limits unless you eat everything on your plate kind of a situation. Um, that's kind of been helpful with me too, with like lunches. So we'll do like a protein and a fruit or whatever grain, but then like maybe like fruit snacks or something, something that is dessert, but now it's less exciting because he's getting it sometimes, but he's not getting in excess, and not getting the nutrition that he needs. And then also I feel like this is the most important is letting your kids see you eat a variety of foods. So um your kids are watching you all the time, and you setting that example is going to be so helpful, and they'll get to see like how you're eating it, what does it sound like when you're eating it. They could even ask you questions, and it can be really helpful for your kids. So I kind of talked about this already. So what is serving a meal family style? So presenting all the foods on the table served to all the family members. So that picture kind of gives like a little example of that. Um, and I know this isn't always feasible. I know sometimes families are doing 5 different things. They have, so and so has soccer practice, so and so has this, and no one's eating at the same time. But sometimes, if possible, it's helpful to have at least a few of the family members eat together, and use this style to kind of help work on any of our kids who are having trouble with trying new foods and expanding their diet a little bit. So why is this beneficial for food exposure? So I kind of talked about this a little bit already, but it exposes your child to all the foods. They can observe them visually, and then they can observe the family members eating those foods. You might have them help serve. So maybe they're like, I don't want to eat this. I wouldn't say, well, you have to or anything. I would just say, okay, that's fine. Like, let's scoop it onto so and so's plate. Or maybe if they don't want it on their plate, you have a separate plate where you're like, okay, you can put it over there and you don't have to eat it right now. Um, Even if they're helping their family members serve it, they're still eating it. They're still picking it up with a utensil. They're still getting to know these foods, and they're able to see all the people around them eating those foods. Um, so yeah, what if my child doesn't eat some of the food? And that's okay. So the best thing to do when using this strategy is, like I talked about earlier, including at least one food within the meal that your child will eat. So I think I used this example before, but they'll eat chicken nuggets. So maybe you do like chicken nuggets, pasta, and fruit salad, what I gave my son earlier tonight for dinner. But you're still including something that that they can fill up on, and it's a protein, and it's something that they'll eat. Even if it's not a protein, it's something that they'll eat and they'll be able to fill up on, and you're not like starving your child. But the whole family's eating it, and you're not making this separate meal. And the child has the opportunity to, what I was saying, of scooping the food, observing others scooping the food, smelling the food, observing how others eat the food. So this is the seating and positioning thing I was talking about before. So this child is at the using the 90-90-90 rule. So his ankles are flat on the floor, so his ankles are at 90 degrees, his knees are at 90 degrees, and his hips are at 90 degrees, and he's able to, like, the table's at an appropriate height where his arms are like resting comfortably. He's about to write something, but this works the same for sitting at the table and eating. So I wouldn't say you need to get a fancy chair or anything. They obviously make lots of chairs that help with this, but like at my house, we don't have a fancy chair, but I've put like a footrest underneath my son's feet. I might put a pillow behind his back. So if he's sitting in an adult chair, so he's going to be sitting super far back and his knees won't be at 90. So I'll put a pillow behind him so his back is resting on there, but then his knees are at 90, and then he has maybe a footrest, or I put some books or something underneath his feet. Or just like a box if you have an extra Amazon box lying around, something for his feet to rest on. Um, you could do something under his bottom too, if he needed to be higher up if the table was a little bit too high. So that is something that can be super helpful too. I always like to give the example that I think someone else gave me this example before of if you go to a restaurant and you go to sit down at one of those high top tables and there's no like the rung is missing or something on your like super high bar stool, so your legs are dangling, you're going to really want to stand more than sit because you don't feel super stable and comfortable in that chair. And it's the same with our kids. So wanting to get up and run around, and I know a lot of kids are seeking out that running around anyways, so giving them some stability there and being able to sit at the table is going to be really helpful, beneficial for that. Um, these are just some ideas of different utensils and different ways you can work on feeding with like in play. So a built-up handle, I would really look at this as if your child is having a really hard time grasping the utensils, this might have like lower muscle tone and they're just having a really hard time grabbing it. Having that thicker utensil, if you don't have like, I know a lot of toddler spoons and forks and stuff, they make them really thick. But if you just have like a regular spoon or fork, you could use a built-up handle, or you could make one with like tape or like something, anything lying around the house that could make it be like a thicker handle. You could use a spoon and a fork within play to feed dolls and cut tennis balls. So something, the froggy feeding fun is nice during mealtime. I like it because it doesn't like the food doesn't like go in anywhere. It's just like that little slot and it's easy to clean. So you could always like at mealtime, maybe like your kid isn't eating it, but like, oh, let's give Froggy a bite. And so they're like using their utensil. Maybe your target is just using the utensil. They're using the utensil and putting it in. Or if it's using the utensil and working on trying new foods, they're still getting that food exposure. You can also just cut a tennis ball and use that. And so you like just squeeze it and open its mouth and you could like put food in. Not as easy to clean as the froggy, but it that also works too. Or sometimes like if I just want to work on using utensils and it's not so much my kid wanting to not wanting to try new foods, I'll use like Play-Doh or something. So we'll pick up like Play-Doh with forks and we'll like put it into the tennis ball mouth. And I said that on the last point there, picking up small pieces of Play-Doh using a fork can be helpful. I'll also sometimes use like spoons in a sensory bin to work on scooping, depending on what your child's preferences are. Okay, so these are some of the resources that I really love. This picture is actually from the Kids Eat in Color that I was talking about before. She has courses on there that you can pay for, but she also has just a ton of free resources for parents. I know she has a lot of handouts. She has an Instagram page that always has really helpful information to work on eating with your kids. So you can search it online, or she has social media, and that can be super helpful for people who use that. Feeding Matters is another good one. So it's a resource that explains pediatric feeding disorders. So I didn't go super deep into a lot of pediatric feeding disorders. I mostly kind of focused on trying to provide just like a basic foundation of how to like begin to approach feeding. So starting with that positive foundation can be really helpful. But obviously getting referred out to specialized feeding therapy can be really beneficial if what you're doing at home is not helping, and you might need a bigger pool of people to help, like the registered dietitian, maybe a team of people working together. And then let's see, yeah, they provide resources for caregivers too. And then the Pediatric Feeding Institute, which is actually, I've taken one of their courses. They do have like courses that um, are mostly geared toward like speech therapists, occupational therapists. I believe it's run by a occupational therapist, and I forget if the other um, clinician is a dietitian or she's a speech therapist. But um, obviously, like parents could always take those courses if they wanted to, but they also provide some resources on there as well. Um, and I feel like I zoomed through a lot of stuff. Um, but hopefully that was helpful. And let me see. Tiffany, should I look in the Q&A? I can look
Yeah,
at that.
I will field those. So yeah, thank you so much, Maggie. That was super informative. I'm actually going to use a lot of these tips on my own kids. So now we'll jump into questions. We've already got a few great questions coming in from the chat and the Q&A, and anybody else who wants to ask questions, go ahead and drop them into the Q&A now. Okay, so first question, do you recommend to parents to prepare in advance the meals for the week? And is it possible to engage the children by making it a fun family activity to prepare the foods for the week?
I think so. I think that you don't have to prepare the meals in advance for the week if you don't want to. Um, but I think that engaging the children in that would be super helpful for kids. And I think involving them in any way you can. So, like I mentioned, having them help you cook the meal if possible can be really helpful. So, yeah, I would absolutely say involve your kids in any of that.
Perfect. Next question. What tips do you have for helping a child learn to chew food?
Okay. I would say a lot of times I'll consult with the SLP that I work with, because she might know, the SLP, he or she might have more insight into the oral motor patterns that your child is using. So something that you can do to start with, I would absolutely try and get an opinion from an SLP, if possible. But something that like we'll try sometimes if your child um might use like a chewy or something, it's like putting something further back and having them work on like biting down on that can be helpful. Something else that I've done, if your child isn't chewing very well and you're afraid that like if they're not chewing well they might choke, you can use, and I actually from the one of the courses from the resources that I shared, they use like mesh. You can get it at like a fabric store. You can use like cheesecloth too, but I didn't like the texture of that in my mouth. So I guess it just depends on if your kid is really sensitive to textures, but like just using really fine mesh, and you can put the food in it and kind of put it into their mouth and work on trying to chew that food without there being a risk of choking. And I'm not sure if it's more the chewing mechanism you're talking about, or you think that they might work on it, but you're afraid that they might choke. But my biggest recommendation is to consult with, to get a speech therapist to evaluate them, to kind of look at their oral motor pattern and see what's going on and how we can help best.
Perfect. How early can we teach children to eat using two hands and handle the fork with the left hand?
Okay, so just kind of using like a fork and a knife, or just like making sure they're holding down the plate at the same time. Um, Either way, I'm thinking maybe it's the second one, like being able to like hold the plate steady and like use the fork or the spoon to eat. Um, I feel like you could start as early as when they're just learning how to use the spoon and the fork. Um, definitely like there's like that picture of my son with the fork. I think he was like 2 maybe. And he was more like scooping with it, but he was still like holding the plate. So I would say like maybe you start out with, the plates and stuff that have like the suction, so like it's stuck to the table. And so they're more so just using the utensil, and then maybe now you kind of go off into they're just using the one that doesn't have the suction, so they're having to like hold it at the same time as like scooping their food or piercing their food with the fork. And then as far as if it was like using a fork and a knife together, I would say like you could use it when they're a little bit older. Um, I know my son, he's 7, and he doesn't currently use like a fork and a knife together. But I would say at any time when your child seems interested in it and wants to, when they're more toward that like elementary age, you're more than welcome to teach them. And I know they sometimes make like um, little like knives that aren't as sharp, to work on that kind of thing.
Okay, next question. Any tips for fun ways to expose foods to a child who is new to foods due to previously having a feeding tube?
Yeah, I would say a lot of that food play that I was talking about. So, um, like you saw the little trucks in the sensory bin with like the spaghettios. I would say trying stuff like that you think that they would like. If you think that they're too sensitive to that still, you might try with something like really small. Maybe something that they like the texture of, just based on what they like to play with in general. I'm not sure um, like how much exposure your child has had to foods, but um, maybe starting with something that they're familiar with even seeing, and kind of have them work on some food play with that. So if you had like an example, maybe they like see you eat cereal or something every day for breakfast. Maybe you're using that cereal in some sort of sensory bin, or they're like, if they're a little older, they're like stringing beads kind of a situation. Or I like to do like if you keep pasta, we always have spaghetti in our house. I'll take spaghetti and like stick it like straight vertical into Play-Doh, and then like it just sticks straight up, and you can like drop the Cheerios down on it. So that's kind of working on fine motor skills at the same time, but it's kind of exposing her to some new foods. If I'm assuming that he or she would be working on the chewing, which I was talking about earlier, with the mesh material, you could try something like that. So working on exposing her to those flavors. I did work with a child who was really hesitant to try fruits once. So it's a different situation. It wasn't with the feeding tube, but or she didn't previously have a feeding tube. But she was just like, she wanted to try the flavors, but she wasn't sure about the texture being just loose in her mouth. So we put apples in the mesh, and she would chew it and get the flavor in her mouth and get used to chewing it, but it wasn't all loose in her mouth. So she was kind of getting used to one thing at a time. Hopefully that's helpful. I know there's probably more questions expanding on that.
Yeah, actually, we have somebody asking, can you expand on what you mean, the mesh material?
Yes. Okay. Let me see. I should have like included an example. I know I just kind of talked about it. I didn't put it in the thing. Um, um so I got a okay, mesh for crafts. I just wanted to pull up something so I could show you guys because I don't want it to go like so if you go into a craft store like Joann Fabrics, or I'm sure maybe even like Walmart or something has it, um, they make like really fine mesh on like a spool, kind of like a really big. Um, I'm describing this horribly. Um, Tiffany, is there a way for me to find a link and send it in the thing, or
You know
uh,
what? We're going to send out a recording.
okay.
So we might be able to just add somebody else had asked if we could include links that you had
Yeah,
shared earlier. So maybe we can do a little recap of some helpful links.
yeah. Let me yeah, absolutely. Let me find an exact link of what I've ordered so that you guys can have that when we send out the link if you guys are wanting to use that. What I do with it is I cut it into squares. And so then I should have brought some from work so I could just show you guys on here. But I cut it into squares, and so I might like put food in it and then you like twist it a lot so that it's just like a ball of food in the mesh kind of a situation, and then be able to put it in so that you're kind of have control of it and it's not gonna like get loose in their mouth at all. Um, Hopefully that's helpful. Hopefully I'll get a link. I'm so sorry. I should have brought that with me.
Okay, next question. What do you recommend for helping children who are extremely texture driven when it comes to food?
I would say, I mean, it depends on what the texture is, but I would say not to, force them into that texture. I think about like myself, there's some textured foods that I really don't like. But there's some food textures that I've gotten used to. Like, I feel like Greek yogurt is a good example versus like regular yogurt. It's a totally different texture. It's kind of gritty. Um, I would say expose through play. I would try some of that if your child is open to that. And maybe try and introduce it with a texture that they already like. Or let's see. The way I would handle it is I wouldn't be forcing them into that texture, but I would expose them to it in safe, non-threatening to them ways. So within play, without making it be like you have to eat this, where they're able to explore it without making them gag. Like I've seen kids gag, and that's when I totally stop working on that and try and backtrack and find something that might be similar but that they might like, and try and work our way back up. And if not, then finding some other foods that might still provide them with the nutrients that they need, but not force them to eat this specific food. I'm not sure if that's helpful. I was kind of rambling for a second, but the kids eat in color, she does give examples of like, my kid won't eat this, and I think that this is helpful for nutrition for this reason. But then she gives some examples of other foods that you can try that provide that same nutritional value without it being like your kid has to eat this other food that maybe they are having a hard time with the texture. Just to give like some other uh, options for your kid.
All right, next question. How early should a child move from eating in a high chair to eating in a booster seat at the table?
I would say whenever you would like to. I think that having your child eating at the table with you kind of also helps with that positive feeding environment. Them having like a separate table, like their little like they basically like the tray is their own little table over there, which it can be super helpful, especially when they're younger, being able to just like wipe that down really fast. But the sooner that you can have them at the table with you and build that positive relationship with like everyone's at the same table together, everyone's eating the same foods, is going to be really helpful. I feel like by the time my son was eating with like a spoon and a fork pretty reliably, we started being more at the table versus eating at the high chair where we were like more spoon feeding him. So I would say like, don't feel like you need to go out and buy something totally new, but if you're able to put them at the table, and you feel like they can be safe at the table and safely get up and down, then I would say that go ahead and start that.
Great. How soon to try to make children get used to sharp flavored foods such as feta cheese, yogurt, kombucha, kimchi, etc.?
I would say you can try any of these foods whenever you would like to. I wouldn't say that there was a certain like time period. You could try and introduce those flavors with foods that you know that they already like. So maybe like you include the feta cheese with their like pasta that they already like to eat. Just kind of like mixing that flavor in, slowly, you wouldn't have to like totally overwhelm them, but maybe just give them like a little bit within something that they already like and get them used to the flavor with something that's familiar without totally, you know, like this is a brand new flavor and maybe they have a weird reaction to it if it's not presented. And they might surprise you. You might give it to them just that and they might actually really like it. But I would say having it accompany something that is familiar to them that you know that they like.
Okay, and looks like the last one we have on here. What food accidents are the most common among children, and how should parents prepare to handle them?
Um, I would say if you're talking about like maybe choking, that sort of thing, I would say choking is the one that I would hear most commonly. Um, there's always like people are allergic to things, like that's a emergency. Um, but I would say choking, and I would make sure that your child is like chewing their food properly. And if you feel like they're not able to chew their food properly and all the way, and you are nervous about them choking on foods as they try new different textured foods or foods that you have to chew a little bit more, I would definitely get a second opinion, or not second opinion, I would get an opinion from you could talk to your pediatrician, but also a pediatric SLP could be really helpful taking a look at that. And I know that there's probably also occupational therapists that have more background in oral motor skills with that. So you might even have an occupational therapist that could go more in depth and take a really close look at how your child is chewing the foods to make sure that they are chewing it safely and able to swallow the food safely. But usually the SLP is your go-to with that. But I would say that would be the top food accident that I've seen.
Perfect. Well, it looks like that is the last question in our queue. Last call if anybody has any other questions. Otherwise, we will go ahead and wrap up.